Hello, my name is Sally Bayley and I'm the author of Girl with Dove, A Life Built by Books. And I'm standing in the middle of Waterstones bookshop in Oxford, where I often come to read, to write and also to teach. I teach here in Oxford at the university. I'd just like to share with you a little bit about my book today. It's a book plotted around words. It starts with three heroines. The first heroine is Miss Marple. I first met Miss Marple when I was 8 years old in this, her first murder mystery, Murder at the Vicarage. And I decided at 8 that I very much wanted to be Miss Marple. Why was that? Because Miss Marple does one or two things only. One of them is she goes out for tea all the time. And secondly, she gets to eat a lot of cake and listen to other people's conversations. I thought this was an extraordinarily wonderful sort of world. It's what I wanted when I was 8 years old. The other thing I love about the Miss Marple stories is there's a lot of fun being made about people who behave badly. The opening of Murder at the Vicarage starts at meal times, and my book really explores the idea of manners, adults behaving badly, adults being rude. So the opening scene involves Mary, who's the maid, waltzing in from the kitchen with her ghastly, nasty food. Mary is really not much help at all. Mary works for Griselda, who is the vicar's wife. And Griselda, we're told early on, is a hopeless cook. Griselda is also distractingly pretty, but utterly incompetent as a housekeeper. So the first scene involves Mary barging in and banging down the greens. And at 8 years old, I thought this was absolutely splendid and that one should be able to behave like this and not in any other way. I grew up in a very religious household, and so when I encountered Griselda and her husband, the vicar Leonard, talking about murder at the dinner table with their very rude maid coming in, I thought to myself, well, okay, this is a religious household, and yet people are speaking of murdering Colonel Prothero over lunch. They're talking about sins and they're making fun of people. They're spending most of their time gossiping. And gossip, I soon began to understand, was a way of learning, of coming into knowledge, of understanding other people's lives, of empathising, if you like, with the things that motivate them and that interest them. And so at the heart of the world of Miss Marple is the idea of gossip and scandal. And Miss Marple, I believe, was a kind of witch, a good fairy. And she, in some way, in my book, Girl with Dove, is related to my grandmother, who was also in my life a good fairy and a good witch. And she taught me to read. That's the most important fact about my grandmother. She taught me to read when my mother was not well enough to teach me. So my grandmother and Miss Marple are absolutely crucial to the structure of this story. It's told very much like a murder mystery. It involves a young girl who's an avid reader, adopting herself, or having herself be adopted, I suppose, by heroines that she reads of in books. And through those books, she creates an alternative family. She puts herself up for adoption to Miss Marple, and then later to Jane Eyre, Charlotte Bronte's classic novel about coming of age, through listening in again and through reading. The first scene in Jane Eyre, we find our 10-year-old heroine hidden behind the curtains, velveteen, red velvet curtains. And at that particular moment in her life, she's being bullied rather horribly by her cousin, John Reed. Jane hates John Reed. And as a 12-year-old reader, I read this when I was 12. I thought it was marvellous to be able to hate boys. I grew up with boys. I had a brother actually called John. I didn't hate my brother John. I in fact cared for him very much, but I was always losing battles and fights with my brothers. Jane Eyre loses the first battle with John Reed. She's sent off to the Red Room, where she's punished for, in fact, hitting John Reed. But overall, in the end, Jane wins out. She transforms her life, and the beginning of the novel sets up the idea of a life being transformed by private knowledge and the private world of her imaginative life spent behind the red curtains. She's reading a book about birds, Berwick's Book of Birds, and she identifies very strongly with the image of the birds which fly over the North Sea. Remote birds, isolated seabirds. And one of the images in my book, one of the recurring motifs in my book, is that of the bird. Sparrows and seagulls, which I grew up around. I live by the seaside, a small seaside town in Sussex called Littlehampton. And later on, and as you'll find out if you read the book, I also sign myself into other people's care. I put myself up for adoption, quite literally. I become a foster child, age 14, and I move through the care system, through various homes and institutions. And inside one of those institutions, which comes to resemble the institution that Jane Eyre is sent to as a 10, 11, 12-year-old, was a place called Colwood, which is a sort of children's home come hospital. And that place, where I spent 2 to 3 years of my adolescent life, merges in my book with Lowood School, which is the place Jane is sent to for being too curious, I would say, for being too inquisitive. I love Jane Eyre because she was a curious child. She asked questions. And in some ways, my book asks the reader to ask questions. I don't give you all the answers. There are many characters in this book. I grew up in a large family. It was dominated by one figure, my aunt. In David Copperfield by Charles Dickens, which is the third big book that builds the plot and the story of Girl with Dove, there's another wonderful aunt who appears, and her name is Betsey Trotwood. And in some ways, she's the most flamboyant of the relatives that I meet in my book. She is a kind of fairy godmother come magical sprite who appears out of nowhere. And my favourite scene in David Copperfield, which is an intimidatingly big book, but it moves fast because it's all told in the first person voice. My favourite scene is when Betsey Trotwood arrives at the door of David Copperfield's house just before he's born with a big hat on. And I grew up in a family of hat wearers. My mother was a seamstress and a milliner. She made hats and she made clothes. And when I read about Betsey Trotwood as a teenager, I felt a very strong allegiance to this woman who simply appeared out of nowhere with a big hat on, peering in through the window. She barges in, unannounced, and simply sits down in the front parlour and proceeds to wait. And what she's waiting for is the nativity, the birth of a child, who she, without a doubt, believes is a girl. Because why on earth would God ever send another boy to this earth? She sits and she waits and she sits and she waits. And the most wonderfully comic scene in this novel is Betsey Trotwood waiting for the screaming upstairs to be over, which is the birth of David. And Betsey Trotwood with her hat on, with cotton wool stuffed into her ears. She's come especially prepared with threads of cotton in her pocket. Very much like the sort of cotton my mother would have worked with. She sits there for a few hours. The doctor, whose name is Dr. Chillip, is running up and down the stairs, managing the screaming. And as a teenager, when I first read David Copperfield, I imagined, of course, that was yet another murder. But it is, in fact, a birth. The baby finally arrives. Betsey Trotwood gets up off her chair, pulls out her cotton wool and congratulates the doctor. At that moment, we begin to understand there's going to be a bit of a falling out, a bit of a row. Dr. Chillip announces the birth. He uses the male pronoun, God help him. Betsey Trotwood whisks off her hat and bashes him on the head, rather hard, and flounces out. And David Copperfield, or rather I should say the narrator of David Copperfield, that is Charles Dickens, describes her rather wonderfully as vanishing like a discontented fairy. And that phrase, discontented fairy, in some way summarises, I think, the emotional life of the young girl in this book, which is based on me, but is also melded with the temperament and the character of Jane Eyre, age 10, 11, 12, and then as she grows up. The temperament and the character of Betsey Trotwood, who is a great flouncer-outer, and the temperament and character of Miss Marple. And in some sense, my book is about a young girl sewing together the particles of sound that she hears floating through the air, through the back garden, through the windows, down her ears, into her body, which transform her understanding of her own history and her own life, and the peculiar goings-on that occurred before she was born.